He wasn't looking to be a hero. The single dad had come for feed and fence wire, nothing more. But the tremor that ran through the dusty wooden platform that day, the sheer raw desperation he witnessed, would unravel everything he thought he'd buried, and quietly, painstakingly rebuild a life he never expected to live again. This story will move you not with noise, but with the quiet power of love, redemption, and the miracles that begin when courage outstrips fear. If stories like this speak to your heart, consider subscribing. It's how we keep bringing you real human hope, one unforgettable story at a time. Now let's begin. The dust hung low in the late summer air, clinging to boots, and brows settling into the worn creases of wooden bleachers that lined the auction yard. The town of Three Pines' population, just under 1,000, was wrapping up its annual livestock auction, a tradition held more for nostalgia than profit, a faint echo of a more prosperous past. Kids still chased each other with sticks, their shouts muted by the oppressive heat. Ranchers leaned against pickup trucks, coffee gone cold, their conversations sporadic, tinged with the weariness of a long season. Faded red and white banners flapped listlessly in the almost still air. The auctioneer, a portly man named Henderson, was wiping sweat from his neck, his voice growing hoarse when a roaring engine and a screech of tires cut through the afternoon torpor. A battered 1908 Chevy truck, fishtailing wildly, careened onto the dusty track surrounding the auction pens. It narrowly avoided colliding with a parked tractor, tires screaming a protest as the driver wrenched the wheel. For a heart-stopping moment, it looked as if the truck would flip, but it straightened, backfired like a gunshot, and shuddered to a halt near the auction platform. In its grimy rearview mirror, Jesse Maddox, who had been inspecting fence posts nearby, caught a fleeting glimpse of a dark, nondescript sedan pulling away from the main road entrance, its occupants obscured by tinted windows, its departure too swift, too deliberate. Heads turned, a wave of murmurs rippling through the crowd. Not because the truck was unfamiliar, most knew its rattling cough, but because Virgil Kane was behind the wheel, and everyone in Three Pines had a story about him. None of them ended happily. He'd been a specter in town for years, his decline a slow public grief. Today, however, there was a new frantic energy about him, a hunted look that went beyond his usual despair. He parked crooked, the engine sputtering and choking off with a final wheezing gasp. The driver's door creaked open, a bottle whiskey half empty clanked to the dusty ground, rolling under the chassis. Virgil Kane lurched out, leaned to the point of gauntness, his eyes hollow and wild, scanning the crowd not just for familiar faces, but as if expecting a specific threat to materialize from the dust. He stumbled, catching himself on the truck bed, then straightened, his movements jerky as he made his way to the passenger side. He fumbled with the handle, and as the door swung open, the already uneasy quiet in the auction yard deepened into a stunned collective intake of breath. The world seemed to freeze. 3 boys, triplets, perhaps 7 years old, no older, emerged. They didn't speak. They didn't cry. They clung to one another like roots to cracked, parched earth, a tiny, silent trinity of bewilderment. One clutched a threadbare, oddly lumpy cloth rabbit, its button eyes staring blankly ahead. Another wore one sneaker and one boot, the mismatched footwear, a small, heartbreaking testament to chaos. The youngest and smallest bore a fresh, angry-looking Band-Aid across his eyebrow, and he kept glancing up at Virgil, then over his shoulder towards the road. Out of town, his small body trembling, as if still hoping someone, anyone, would rescue him from this strange, terrifying errand. Virgil, ignoring the swelling tide of whispers and condemning stares, walked them to the edge of the auction platform. His hand trembled as he reached for the first boy, a tremor that spoke not just of alcohol withdrawal, but of a profound, bone-deep fear. People watched, murmurs swelling and dying like troubled waves. No one knew what was happening. Not yet. Then, with a visible effort that seemed to drain the last of his strength, he climbed onto the wooden stage. He turned to the crowd, raising a hand not steady, but not entirely shaking either. A hush fell so profound that the buzzing of flies sounded like roaring engines. Even the children, sensing the gravity of the moment, had stopped their games. "I ain't here to sell livestock." Virgil said, his voice a ragged rasp that barely carried over the sudden silence. He looked towards Henderson, a desperate plea in his eyes. "Henderson, you know they ain't safe with me. Not anymore. Tell 'em." Henderson looked troubled, glancing from Virgil to the local sheriff, Buck Hatcher, who was now moving slowly towards the platform, his hand resting near his sidearm. "Virgil, what in Sam Hill are you doing?" Buck called out, his voice firm but not unkind. Virgil ignored him. "I'm here to do the last thing I still might do right," he declared, his voice cracking. He gestured towards the three small, bewildered figures beside him. "They ain't mine by blood. I married their mama Sarah after their no-good daddy ran off. She passed last year. Pneumonia. No health insurance, you know the story." He wiped his mouth with the back of a shaking hand. Someone coughed a sharp, nervous sound. Someone else whispered, "Oh God, those poor children." "I tried." Virgil continued, his gaze sweeping the crowd, landing on no one in particular. "Lord knows I tried. Gave up drinking for a while. Took jobs no decent man should have to take. Tried raising them right like she would have wanted." His eyes flickered again to the road, then back to the crowd. "But I can't do it anymore. I'm tired and I'm sick and I'm not what they need. There are things. Wolves, Henderson, just like I told Sarah. They won't stop. And they're closing in." He stepped aside, pushing the boys slightly forward. They looked up at him, then at the sea of unfamiliar staring faces. The youngest one's lower lip trembled, but he still didn't cry. He just reached into his pocket and handed Virgil a crumpled picture stick figures drawn with love and shaky crayons, a house, a dog, a man holding three boys' hands. A dream of a life that had never truly been. "I'm not here to dump them." Virgil choked out, his voice breaking entirely now. "I'm here to beg. Someone here, someone better than me. Take them in. Please, keep them safe. There's wolves out there and I can't fight 'em off no more." Virgil stared at the drawing, his face contorting. Then he pulled a small object from his own pocket, a wooden carving of a feather, worn smooth by years of being held thumbed over. "I carved this for them. For Sarah. Last Christmas. That was my best day. That was the last good day I remember." He placed it gently on the platform beside the boys, a strange counterpoint to the lumpy rabbit one still clutched. Then, before Sheriff Hatcher could reach him, Virgil Kane stumbled off the stage, pushed past a few onlookers, and disappeared behind a stack of hay bales, leaving an echoing silence and three small boys standing alone. No one moved. The wind stirred dust around the children's small scuffed shoes. Someone in the crowd sniffled audibly. A woman clutched her purse so tightly her knuckles were white. A few hats were doffed, a gesture of respect or perhaps pity, but no one stepped forward. The silence stretched thick with unspoken questions and a heavy sense of communal shame. Who would take on such a burden? Who would step into the wreckage of Virgil Kane's life until one man did? Jesse Maddox, tall and quiet, a man whose presence was as familiar and unassuming as the weathered barns dotting the landscape. He spoke like the earth seldom, but when he did, it mattered. He wore a denim shirt, faded by sun, and time sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms, corded with work dirt, permanently etched beneath his nails. His boots were cracked at the heel, testament to miles walked on hard land. His face bore the lines of a storm that had passed through and stayed a while, leaving its mark in the set of his jaw and the shadows in his eyes. Most of Three Pines remembered Jesse as the man who lost his boy Luke 3 years ago. A congenital heart defect had stolen him too soon. Jesse hadn't spoken much since, had retreated into a shell of quiet labor and solitude. But now he walked slowly, steadily towards the stage. He had no clipboard, no bidding paddle, just a small weathered wooden box held carefully in one hand. He climbed the 2 steps onto the platform. Kneeling before the 3 boys who flinched slightly at his approach, Jesse opened the box. It was the box that held his most precious mementos of Luke. A first tooth, a favorite marble, a single perfectly smooth skipping stone. Alongside them, almost hidden, were 3 cloth patches, hand-stitched, frayed but clean. Each bore a single potent word: hope, safe, home. He'd made them for Luke's scout blanket, tokens of promises he hadn't been able to keep. He looked each boy in the eye, his gaze steady, unflinching, impossibly kind. "I don't have much." Jesse said, his voice low, a little rough from disuse, but clear. "But I've got a roof, some bread, and enough room for 3 small beds. If you're willing, you can come with me." The middle child, Caleb, though Jesse wouldn't know his name until later, reached out. First, his small dirt-stained finger tentatively touching the patch labeled hope. Then the eldest, Eli, a thoughtful frown on his face, nodded slowly and stepped a fraction closer. Finally, Noah, the smallest, the one with the Band-Aid and the lumpy rabbit, looked to where Virgil had vanished, a flicker of desolation in his wide eyes, then back at Jesse. He hesitated, then reached up, placing his small hand not on a patch, but on Jesse's chest, right over his heart. And something in Jesse Maddox, something long frozen and broken, cracked, splintered, and then miraculously began to mend in that very same instant. The crowd exhaled a collective sigh that seemed to lift some of the oppressive weight from the air. No applause, no cheers, just a profound, shared stillness. But one old rancher, Micah Stewart, took off his battered Stetson, stepped forward a pace, and murmured, his voice thick with emotion, "You didn't just take them in, son. You brought this town back to life." Sheriff Hatcher, who had paused at the edge of the stage, gave Jesse a single solemn nod of respect before turning to quietly confer with Henderson, likely about Virgil's whereabouts and the unsettling image of that disappearing sedan. The road home was long and uneven, gravel clicking and spitting beneath the tires of Jesse Maddox's rusted pickup. In the back seat, 3 boys sat in a tight, silent row, shoulders barely touching, like 3 leaves blown into the same sheltered ditch by an unkind wind. No one spoke. Jesse kept his eyes on the road, hands steady on the wheel, his knuckles white. His heart, though, felt anything but steady. It hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear, uncertainty, and a strange, terrifying flicker of something he hadn't dared feel in 3 years' purpose. He hadn't planned to bring anyone home that day. He'd gone to the auction for hay, just enough to last his old mule Gracie through the coming season. Instead, he drove away with 3 small, silent passengers and a knot in his chest that hadn't let go since Noah, the smallest, had placed his hand over Jesse's heart. The weight of that small hand was immense. They didn't ask questions, didn't cry, didn't even look out the windows at the passing fields of sun-baked corn and fading sunflowers. Only when the truck turned down the narrow, rutted dirt path leading to Jesse's weathered cabin did Caleb, the middle one, finally speak, his voice a thin whisper. Are there animals?" Jesse glanced at him through the rearview mirror, his own reflection startlingly unfamiliar, with 3 small heads bobbing in the back. One mule named Gracie. She's temperamental as a rained-on cat, but she listens better than most people. Caleb nodded, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. The other 2 boys remained silent, but Jesse caught a flicker of wary curiosity in Eli's dark eyes. The house came into view, a 2-bedroom cabin built by Jesse's grandfather, nestled somewhat precariously between two aging monumental cottonwoods. The porch sagged slightly on one end, a testament to time and neglect. Smoke, however, trickled thinly from the stone chimney, a sign of recent life. To anyone else, it might have looked like a forgotten place, a relic slowly surrendering to the elements. To Jesse, it had always been just enough a fortress against the world. Now suddenly it felt terribly small, terribly inadequate. He parked the engine groaning in protest, then stepped out and opened the back door of the truck. The boys hesitated, their eyes wide and uncertain, scanning the cabin, the overgrown yard, the dark line of trees beyond. The far edge of the woods bordered a notoriously treacherous ravine known locally as Widow's Drop, a place old-timers said held more secrets than stars. "You don't have to be afraid," Jesse said, his voice lower than he intended, almost gentle. It felt foreign on his tongue. "You can come in when you're ready. No one's going to rush you." Caleb, ever the slightly bolder one, jumped down first, landing with a small thud. Eli followed, clutching a tattered book Jesse hadn't noticed before. Noah, however, hung back his small hand, still protectively, on his lumpy rabbit. Jesse crouched beside him, not touching, just near enough to offer a silent reassurance. "I know it's new and scary," he said, meeting Noah's frightened gaze. "But you've got my word. No one's going to leave you behind here. This is a safe place now." Noah looked up, his eyes large and luminous in the fading light, and gave a single jerky nod. Then he slid off the seat and, with a visible summoning of courage, followed his brothers up the creaking porch steps. Inside, the cabin was humble but clean. Wood floors, scuffed and grooved by decades of life, gleamed faintly from a recent scrubbing. The walls were lined with old tools, carefully hung, and shelves crammed with books, his grandfather's histories, his wife Mary's gardening annuals, Luke's dog-eared adventure stories. A cast-iron stove popped and hissed softly in the corner, radiating a comforting warmth against the evening chill. Mary had once decorated the place with soft, brightly colored rag rugs and mason jars filled with sunflowers. After she passed, and then Luke, Jesse had packed those memories away, consigning the bright colors to a cedar chest in the attic. Maybe someday, he thought now, a sudden aching pang in his chest, maybe he'd have reason to open that box again. "I'll show you where you'll sleep," Jesse said, his voice still husky, guiding them down a narrow, dimly lit hall. The second bedroom. Luke's old room was small. It now held two narrow cots Jesse had hastily dragged from the barn, and a folded-up mattress on the floor between them. Not much, but the blankets were clean and smelled faintly of cedar and lavender. Caleb stepped in first, his eyes sweeping the space with cautious approval. Can we stay here tonight?" He asked the question, hanging heavy with unspoken anxieties. Jesse looked at him, then at Eli, who was staring at the faded outline on the wall where Luke's World's Best Fisherman certificate had once hung. He looked at Noah, who was peeking under one of the cots, his rabbit held like a shield. "You can stay as long as you need." Jesse said the words, feeling more like a vow than an offer. "This is your room now." Noah walked over to the single window, peering out at the darkening trees that pressed close to the cabin. "Does it get cold here?" he asked, his voice barely audible, addressed more to the glass than to Jesse. Jesse nodded. "Sometimes, real cold. But we keep the fire going strong, and I've got an extra quilt or two. Good thick ones." Noah didn't smile, but his small shoulders seemed to relax just a fraction. Eli, meanwhile, had moved to a small, dusty bookshelf. His fingers traced the spine of a worn copy of Treasure Island. Then his gaze fell upon a framed photograph on the wall, one Jesse hadn't had the heart to take down, Jesse, and a young laughing boy, both proudly displaying a string of sunfish beside a glistening fishing pole. "That your son?" Eli asked, his voice quiet but direct. Jesse froze the air, leaving his lungs in a silent rush. The question, so innocent, landed like a physical blow. Yes, he said, the word catching in his throat. He cleared it. Finally. Yes, that's Luke. He passed away. Few years back now. None of the boys spoke. There were no platitudes, no awkward condolences. Instead, Eli reached out a small, hesitant hand and gently touched the edge of the photo frame, a quiet, profound acknowledgement that said more than any words could have. That night, Jesse made scrambled eggs and toast, the only dinner he could rustle up without a trip to the general store. A trip he now realized was an urgent necessity. The boys ate slowly, methodically, but cleaned their plates. Jesse noticed with a pang how they passed the butter to each other without needing to be told, how Caleb automatically ensured Noah got a fair share before serving himself. Small things, silent testimonials to how long they'd been fending for and relying on each other. After dinner, he washed the dishes at the porcelain sink, the unfamiliar clatter echoing in the usually silent kitchen. The boys explored the living room, their movements tentative at first, then bolder. They picked up books, their fingers tracing titles. They peeked behind the worn floral couch, discovered a loose floorboard under a cushion, and whispered about it in hushed, excited tones. It was the first genuine sound of childhood Jesse had heard in his house in 3 long, desolate years. It was both heartbreaking and beautiful. Before bed, Jesse stoked the wood stove in their room until it glowed cherry red and tucked an old hand-stitched Afghan Mary's work over Noah's mattress on the floor. He lingered in the doorway, longer than he intended, an unfamiliar ache in his chest. Caleb was already curled under his blanket, a small, still mound. Eli lay on his side, the borrowed copy of Treasure Island open on his chest, though his eyes were closed. And Noah. Noah was watching Jesse, his gaze unnervingly direct in the flickering firelight. Do you read stories?" The boy asked, his voice a mere breath. Jesse blinked, caught off guard. "I used to," he admitted, his own voice softer now. "To my son, yes. Haven't in a long time." Noah nodded solemnly, a little man considering grave matters. "Maybe tomorrow," he suggested, a statement more than a question. "Maybe tomorrow." Jesse agreed, the words a fragile promise. He reached for the light switch, then paused. "Good night, boys." A mumbled "night" came from Caleb. Eli just stirred. Noah remained silent, watching. Jesse turned off the light, plunging the room into the comforting dance of firelight and shadows. The house went quiet, save for the crackle of the fire and the sigh of the wind in the cottonwoods. Later, alone in his own Spartan room, Jesse sat on the edge of his narrow bed, elbows on knees, staring at his calloused, empty hands. He hadn't touched a Bible, hadn't uttered a formal prayer since Luke's funeral. But tonight, he found himself whispering not a prayer, exactly just a thought, a plea sent out into the encompassing dark. "I don't know why you brought them to me, Lord, or whoever's listening. I'm not good at this anymore. I'm broken myself. I don't know what to give them." He took a shuddering breath. "But I'll show up. I promise you that. I'll be here every day. For them." As he lay back, the wind rattled a loose shutter, a mournful sound that usually amplified his loneliness. He closed his eyes, expecting the familiar ache of loss. But for the first time in 3 long years, he didn't dream of his son's fading laughter or his wife's gentle touch. He dreamed instead of hushed whispers and the faint, sweet scent of wood smoke in the next room. He dreamed of small hands and a tentative hope. Morning came quietly. Jesse woke not to the harsh blare of an alarm clock or the cheerful chirping of bird song, but to the subtle, rich scent of wood smoke from the kitchen stove and the faintest shuffle of bare feet across the hall. For a disorienting moment, he forgot. For a heart-stopping moment, he thought the house was empty again, that the previous day had been a bizarre, pain-filled dream. Then he heard a whisper, sharp and urgent, followed by a soft, quickly stifled laugh. He sat up slowly, every muscle protesting, blinking against the pale gray light, slipping through the grimy window blinds. Pulling on his boots, a familiar ritual that felt utterly new, he stepped into the hallway. The boys were huddled in the kitchen, a precarious, mismatched stack of wooden crates wobbling beneath Caleb's feet as he stretched precariously towards the top shelf of the pantry. Eli steadied the crates, his face a mask of concentration, while Noah stood by with a chair ready to add it to the tower if needed. Caleb looked over his shoulder, startled, nearly losing his balance. We were trying to find the pancake mix," he said, his voice a mixture of defiance and apology. "Matter of fact, you said we could stay." Jesse rubbed the back of his neck, a ghost of a smile tugging at his lips. "I did say that, and I meant it." He paused, his gaze sweeping over their earnest, slightly grimy faces. "But next time you ask before you try to climb my whole house like a family of raccoons. Deal?" Eli grinned, a flash of white teeth in his smudged face. "We were careful." Jesse chuckled, a dry, rusty sound he barely recognized as his own. He opened the correct cabinet lower down, well within their reach, and pulled out a half-used box of pancake mix. "All right, you hungry outlaws. I'll show you how it's done today. Tomorrow you can try, under strict supervision." Noah looked at him solemnly from his post by the chair, his small brow furrowed. "Even me. Especially you," Jesse said, ruffling Noah's already unruly hair, a spontaneous gesture that surprised them both. The old stove hissed as Jesse poured batter onto the hot, greased griddle. The kitchen slowly filled with the sweet, simple scent of cooking flour, melting butter, and an unfamiliar warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. For the first time, the boys didn't sit in watchful silence. They chattered. They asked about Gracie, his mule. Was she really that temperamental about the dilapidated barn? Were there bats about the dense woods surrounding the cabin? Were there snakes, bears, or even, as Eli hopefully suggested, hidden treasure in Widow's Drop? Jesse answered each question with a calm, measured tone, the words coming more easily, now surprised by his own patience. Profoundly grateful for the noise, the boundless curiosity, the burgeoning fragile life filling his silent kitchen. They ate together at the scarred wooden table, the boys wolfing down pancakes slathered in syrup, as if they hadn't eaten a real satisfying meal in weeks. Jesse watched them, a quiet awe blooming in his chest. Not because they were perfect or polite or easy, but because they were still here, still trying, still somehow children. After breakfast, a newfound energy thrumming through him, and they all went outside into the crisp morning air. Gracie, as expected, made a dramatic display of disinterest in the boys, snorting, swishing her tail dismissively, and pointedly turning her rump towards them. Then, after a suitable show of disdain, she eventually trotted over to nudge Eli gently in the chest, her large, soft nose exploring his pockets for treats. The boy laughed, a pure, uninhibited sound, as he stroked the mule's coarse, wiry fur as if it were the finest silk. "She likes you," Jesse observed, leaning against a fence post. Eli beamed, his face alight with a joy so potent it was almost painful to witness. Out in the sprawling, overgrown yard, Jesse handed each of them small, manageable chores, helping him carry split firewood to the porch, scooping feed for the now placated Gracie, gathering dry kindling from beneath the cottonwoods. They moved with surprising competence, understanding his simple instructions without endless questions, and working together with an unspoken, practiced coordination that hinted at long months, perhaps years of shared responsibility, that more than anything struck Jesse with a fresh wave of sorrow and admiration. These weren't children who'd been coddled or indulged. They'd survived. They'd learned to function, to cope in the stark, unforgiving cracks between what a child desperately needs and what the world sometimes cruelly fails to provide. After the chores were done, Jesse told them they could have the rest of the afternoon to themselves. Caleb, ever the explorer, wanted to investigate the murky, tangled edge of the woods, his eyes drawn to the shadowed depths of Widow's Drop. Eli predictably asked if he could borrow another book, his eyes already scanning the shelves through the cabin window. Noah, however, didn't ask for anything. He simply sat on the porch steps, a small, still figure with a cheap-lined notebook and a stubby pencil Jesse didn't remember handing him. He was drawing his tongue poking out in concentration, his lumpy rabbit propped beside him like a silent confidant. By mid-afternoon, the cabin and its surroundings had settled into a state Jesse hadn't felt in a long, long time peace. Not the empty, aching peace of solitude, but a full breathing peace punctuated by the distant shouts of Caleb from the woods, the rustle of pages as Eli read on the porch swing, and the scratching of Noah's pencil. When Jesse returned from stacking logs by the dilapidated woodshed, his muscles pleasantly sore. Eli was waiting for him by the screen door, a folded sheet of paper held loosely in his hand. I wrote something, he said shyly, his gaze fixed on his worn sneakers. He held out the paper. Jesse took it, unsure what to expect. A school assignment, perhaps a list. It wasn't long, just a few short stanzas written in blocky, uneven letters, the pencil lines smudged in places. But the words struck Jesse like a gentle fist to the heart. He doesn't smile much, but he stays. He doesn't talk a lot, but he hears. He brings pancakes and makes the fire warm. He didn't leave us there. That's all we needed. Just for now. Jesse didn't speak for a long moment, the simple, powerful truth of the boy's words washing over him. He reread the lines, his vision blurring slightly. Eli watched him fidgeting nervously with the frayed cuffs of his sleeves. You don't have to like it, Eli said quickly, his voice small. It's probably no good. I do, Eli. Jesse said, his own voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. I do more than like it. It's a fine poem, a true one. He folded the poem carefully, reverently, not stuffing it into a pocket or tossing it onto a cluttered drawer, but tucking it into the pages of a treasured volume of Robert Frost that lay on the side table. A safe place, a place of memory and significance. You ever think about writing more of these? Jesse asked, meeting Eli's earnest gaze. Eli shrugged, a flush rising on his cheeks. Sometimes. Mama used to write songs. Sometimes. I think it helps me think clearer. Helps get the tangled things out. Well, you should keep doing it, Jesse said, his voice firm. If it helps, I will. Eli promised, a small, tentative smile gracing his lips. If that's okay. Jesse gave a soft, affirming nod. It's more than okay, Eli. It's good. That evening, Jesse, feeling a renewed sense of purpose, cooked again. This time it was a pot of hearty vegetable stew simmered for hours on the stove, its aroma of garlic, thyme, and bay leaf filling the small cabin with a rich, comforting scent. Caleb, taking initiative, set the table with chipped plates and mismatched cutlery. Eli, with surprising meticulousness, folded the rough paper napkins into careful triangles. Noah, in absolute focused silence, placed the silverware precisely his expression, no longer cautious or fearful, but absorbed, almost peaceful. After dinner, they sat on the porch as twilight bled into the sky, painting it in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange. Jesse had thought about bringing out the old dusty guitar he hadn't touched in years, the one Mary had loved to hear him play. He didn't. Not yet. But the idea, which once would have filled him with a paralyzing grief, now held a faint, distant glimmer of possibility. Instead, he brought out a second quilt, one of Mary's thickest. The nights were starting to carry a distinct autumn chill. He wrapped it gently around Noah, who had again claimed the corner of the porch steps as his designated perch, his lumpy rabbit nestled in his lap. Does this place Does this place always feel this quiet? Noah asked, his voice soft as the falling dew, his gaze fixed on the first stars blinking into existence overhead. Jesse considered the question, rocking slowly in his grandfather's old chair. It used to feel empty. He admitted the truth, raw but necessary. Real empty, but no, not quiet like this. This is different. Noah nodded, a thoughtful expression on his small face. It's a good quiet. Yeah. Jesse said, a warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the stew or the fire. Yeah, son, it is. And then, without planning to, without meaning to, he found himself telling them about Luke, about fishing trips to Miller's Creek, the thrill of the first catch, the inevitable tangled lines, about their shared love for silly comic books and tall tales, about scraped knees, secret forts built in the woods, and the funny way Luke used to hum slightly off-key when he was deeply concentrating on a drawing or a school project. The words tumbled out haltingly at first, then with a growing ease, like a dam breaking after years of holding back a flood of memories. The boys didn't interrupt. They didn't offer pity or trite condolences. They just listened, their faces serious in the fading light, their presence a silent, unwavering anchor. Later, as a canopy of brilliant stars glittered overhead, Jesse tucked the boys into their beds. Caleb whispered a sleepy, "Good night, Jesse," the name still slightly tentative on his tongue. Eli followed with a simple, heartfelt, "Thanks for everything." Monist. Noah, as usual, said nothing, but, as Jesse adjusted his blanket, he found the drawing Noah had made earlier tucked carefully under his pillow. It was another stick-figure family, but this time there were 4 of them. One figure was taller than the others, with a scribbled beard. In blocky, uncertain letters above their heads, Noah had printed "New Family." Beside it, with more care, "Home." Jesse stood in the darkened hallway, long after the boy's breathing had evened out into the soft rhythms of sleep. And for the second night in a row, looking at the rough drawing in his calloused hand, he didn't feel alone. He felt full. The library in Three Pines had never aspired to grandeur. It was a single, somewhat cramped room tucked into the back of the old town hall, a space that smelled perpetually of aging paper, lemon polish, and the faint, lingering scent of hope. 2 rows of donated, mismatched bookshelves stood sentinel, their spines a chaotic tapestry of genres and eras. The circulation desk, scarred and ink-stained, doubled as a lost and found repository, and occasionally a makeshift therapy couch for lonely patrons. The community bulletin board was a chaotic masterpiece held together by a fervent prayer and an alarming number of mismatched thumbtacks. But to Evelyn Whitmore, it was a sanctuary. She had arrived 3 weeks prior, a refugee from a recently imploded marriage in Charlotte, and a career that had felt more like a gilded cage. She'd traded the insistent buzz of city life for the profound, almost startling stillness of a town where the most pressing daily news was whether the predicted rain would arrive before the fall harvest. Her official title was part-time librarian, a designation that belied the full-time fervor with which she had thrown herself into her duties. She was rebuilding not just a small-town library, but herself, one alphabetized book, one mended binding at a time. She cherished the quietude of the place. The way the light filtered through the tall, wavy glass windows, the instinctive hush that fell over even the most boisterous children upon crossing its threshold. She did not, however, expect 3 small, determined boys to burst through the front door one Tuesday afternoon like a miniature whirlwind, shattering the comfortable silence, and bringing with them a gust of fresh, unpredictable energy from another world. Caleb led the charge, his worn backpack bouncing with every enthusiastic step. Eli followed close behind a book already tucked firmly under one arm, his expression serious and studious. Noah trailed last, as always, his eyes large and startlingly observant, scanning the room with the cautious alertness of a tiny soldier entering potentially hostile territory. His lumpy rabbit clutched to his chest. "Afternoon," Evelyn said, looking up from the meticulous task of cataloging a new donation of romance novels, a slight smile touching her lips. She had a calm, welcoming presence that children and stray animals seemed to instinctively trust. "First time here," Caleb announced, his voice ringing with an importance that suggested this was a momentous occasion. Our new dad said we could check out books." He hesitated over the word dad, a slight catch in his voice that Evelyn didn't miss. Evelyn blinked her hand, pausing over her check-in ledger. "Your dad? His name's Jesse Maddox," Eli explained, stepping forward. "But he's not really our dad, not by blood like. But he took us in, so it still counts. He said it counts." Evelyn's smile softened. Jesse Maddox. The name sent a quiet ripple through her thoughts. She'd seen him in town, of course, a handful of times at the hardware store, the post office. Tall, quiet, a man who seemed to carry an invisible shield of solitude around him. She also remembered the whispers, the hushed, sympathetic stories of the boy he'd lost, the profound, unbroken silence that had enveloped him in the years that followed. To hear him referred to as Dad, even tentatively by these three waifs, was surprising and strangely moving. "Well," she said gently, her voice warm and inviting, "you're all very welcome here. I'm Evelyn, and I think it counts very much." The boys nodded in unison, their initial boisterousness tempered by the quiet solemnity of the library. Caleb, a boy of action, went straight for the adventure shelf, his fingers eagerly tracing the spines of books promising pirates and treasure islands. Eli, the burgeoning poet, hovered near the slim volumes of poetry, his expression rapt. Noah, however, stood in the exact center of the room, unmoving, his gaze fixed on a faded, slightly crooked painting on the far wall. A depiction of a solitary log cabin, blanketed in deep snow, a thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney. Evelyn walked around the scarred circulation desk, her movements quiet and unobtrusive. She crouched slightly as she approached Noah so her voice wouldn't carry too far, wouldn't startle him. "That's a print by a local artist, a Mrs. Gable. She passed on some years ago," Evelyn said softly, her gaze following Noah's to the painting. "She painted it after the big blizzard of '78. Said the snow brought everything to a dead stop, made the whole world quiet. And that's when she finally heard herself think clearly for the first time in years." Noah didn't respond, didn't even turn his head, but his small fingers, smudged with dirt and pencil lead, reached out to brush the dusty wooden frame of the painting. Evelyn didn't press. Children, she'd learned from years of volunteering before her library degree, often needed less noise and more space to process the world. An hour later, the boys each clutched 2 carefully selected books, checked out under a brand new family card. Evelyn had paused when it came to writing the surname. "Maddox?" she'd asked, gently looking at Jesse's name already on the card. Caleb had nodded decisively. "Yeah, Maddox." So, Maddox, Caleb, Eli, and Noah was written in her neat, precise script. They thanked her, their voices, a chorus of awkward but sincere gratitude, then tumbled out of the library as exuberantly as they had entered, leaving a lingering trail of dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun. Evelyn stood for a long time behind the desk, watching the sturdy oak door long after it had swung shut, a thoughtful expression on her face. The next day she saw Jesse. He stood at the town's small, cluttered hardware store, comparing galvanized bolts, with the quiet, focused deliberation of a man who had likely rebuilt many things with his own 2 hands fences. Barns, perhaps even she mused a shattered heart. She hesitated for a moment, then on an impulse she didn't quite understand, she stepped closer. "Hi," she said, her voice a little breathless. He turned his eyes a surprising shade of hazel flecked with gold, sharp assessing but not unkind. He took a second as if searching his memory banks for her name, a slight furrow in his brow. "I'm Evelyn." She offered a small smile playing on her lips. "From the library. The boys visited yesterday." Recognition sparked in his eyes, and the harsh lines around his mouth softened almost imperceptibly. "Ah, yes. Evelyn." The boys were enthusiastic about their visit. "And the books." "That's usually a good sign," she smiled. "Or at least not a terrible one. They're good boys, Jesse." He gave a faint, rusty chuckle, a sound that seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. They came home arguing over which books to read first. Caleb wanted adventure. Eli was quoting poetry before he even opened the cover fully. Noah just held his very close. It was new. Good new, I hope. The best kind. He admitted, his gaze dropping to the bolts in his hand for a moment, as if uncomfortable with the directness of her scrutiny, or perhaps his own uncharacteristic openness. There was a pause. Not an awkward one, but an unrushed, comfortable silence, the kind that often settles between people who are used to their own company and don't feel the need to fill every empty space with chatter. Evelyn gestured towards his half-filled cart. "Building something. Fixing." He corrected his voice, rumbling low. "Barn door. Came half off its hinges in last week's wind. Needs more than just patching this time. The boys say it's haunted now, bangs in the night." She laughed, a real spontaneous laugh, soft and melodic, like wind chimes. Jesse looked at her, then a longer, more direct gaze than before, a flicker of something unreadable in his hazel eyes. Then he looked away, clearing his throat. "Well," she said, stepping back suddenly, feeling a bit flustered. "If you ever need more haunted stories, or perhaps some less haunted building manuals, the library's fully stocked." Jesse nodded, a hint of a genuine smile touching his lips this time. "Appreciate that, Evelyn. I'll keep it in mind." She left first with a polite nod. But he watched her go, her upright posture, the way her auburn hair caught the light, until she disappeared around the corner of the feed store. He stood there for a long moment, a bolt still in his hand, a strange, unfamiliar lightness in his chest. That weekend, Evelyn found a folded piece of paper slipped into the overnight book drop. No envelope, no indication of who it was, from just a note written in shaky but determined blocky handwriting on lined school paper, "Miss Evelyn. Thank you for the books. I liked the one about the boy who found a new home with the fishermen. I think that's what's happening to us. Kind of. Eli Maddox." She read it 3 times, her heart swelling. Eli Maddox. He'd claimed the name. She carefully tucked the note inside the pages of her personal journal, a small, precious secret. The following Tuesday, Jesse returned to the library. This time he came alone. Evelyn glanced up from her desk, surprised but not startled by his presence. He held a worn, rather esoteric-looking paperback in his hand, something from the philosophy shelf, a section well beyond the usual reach of his newly acquired sons. "Figured I ought to check out something for myself." He set a slight flush on his high cheekbones. "Lead by example and all that. Besides," he added, looking around the quiet room, "it's peaceful in here. You might be the first person to touch that particular volume of Marcus Aurelius in at least 6 years." She replied, a teasing glint in her eye as she scanned it. "You may be single-handedly reviving forgotten wisdom in 3 Pines." He smiled, a genuine, almost boyish smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes and transformed his rugged face. "Someone's got to." They spoke for a few more minutes that day. About books, naturally. About the neglected patch of earth behind the library that she dreamed of turning into a children's reading garden. about the changing colors of the leaves on the maple tree outside her window, about nothing of consequence, and yet somehow about everything that mattered. When Jessie left, the little bell above the door chimed once a cheerful, hopeful sound. Evelyn turned to the window and watched him walk away, his shoulders straighter, his stride more purposeful than she remembered. And for the first time in a long lonely, while she didn't feel quite like the only soul in Three Pines actively looking for and perhaps even tentatively building a second chance. A shadow began to fall over Three Pines, subtle at first, like the first chill of an unwelcome autumn. It started with hushed whispers at the general store, a strange car, the same dark sedan Jessie had glimpsed, seen parked down secluded dirt roads, an unfamiliar, sharply dressed man, asking quiet, pointed questions at the diner. This man, Arthur Finch, was the visible edge of Virgil's Wolves. Evelyn, with her librarian's habit of observing and connecting disparate pieces of information, was among the first to notice his persistent inquiries. He wasn't just asking about Virgil. He was asking about Sarah, about anything she might have left behind for the boys, something valuable enough to clear a significant debt. His eyes were cold gray as a winter sky, and his stillness was more menacing than any overt threat. He'd even visited the library not for books, but for information which Evelyn had politely, firmly declined to provide. Jessie, too, felt the tightening coil of unease. Old Man Hemlock from the feed store mentioned Finch. Looked like city trouble, Jessie. Hemlock had warned, his eyes shrewd. Said something about a legacy Sarah Kane might have squirreled away. Not money, he said. Something more compromising. Jessie brushed it off initially, but the unease lingered a knot in his gut. He'd seen the desperation in Virgil's eyes, heard the cryptic warning. Wolves, they won't stop. The boys, particularly Noah, seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere. Noah grew quieter if possible, his lumpy rabbit held even tighter. He began having nightmares again, muffled cries that brought Jessie to his doorway in the dead of night, his heart pounding. Once Jessie found him awake, staring at the window, his small face pale. There's a bad man outside, Jessie. He'd whispered, his voice trembling. He was looking at our window. Jessie had checked, found nothing, and dismissed it as a bad dream. But Noah's fear felt chillingly real and aligned with the shadow of Finch's presence. The true nature of the looming threat, however, was revealed not by whispers, but by the wind, a fierce howling gale that swept through Three Pines one particularly dark night. It didn't come quietly. It started as an ominous whisper through the high branches of the cottonwoods, and then rapidly grew into a low, growling roar, rattling shutters, lifting porch mats, and with a sickening crack, throwing open barn doors that had held fast against storms for decades. Jessie woke to the violent thump of wood against wood, followed by the unmistakable, sickening clatter of something heavy crashing to the ground inside his barn. By the time he'd pulled on his boots and grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight, the rain had started, not a gentle shower, but thin, stinging needles of it, driven almost horizontally by the furious wind. He found the main barn door, the one he'd been meaning to fix properly, swinging wildly on a single tortured hinge, slamming against the frame, like a crazed, arrhythmic heartbeat. Inside, Gracie whinnied in terror, her hooves clacking and skittering dangerously on the damp wooden floorboards. Jessie stepped inside, one hand automatically going to soothe her quivering flank, his eyes adjusting to the flickering, unreliable beam of his flashlight. The storm, with malicious force, had peeled back a significant section of the roof on the western wall, leaving a gaping hole, and the interior exposed to the relentless assault of wind and rain. A heavy feed bin had toppled, spilling precious oats, their winter supply, across the rapidly soaking floor. Tools were scattered as if thrown by an angry giant. A sturdy shovel lay snapped in half, its handle splintered. It would take days, perhaps weeks, and more money than he currently had to repair the extensive damage. He sighed, a long, low sound of frustration and weariness. then turned as the wavering beam of his flashlight caught movement at the now precarious barn door. 3 small, rain-slicked silhouettes stood there. Caleb, Eli, and Noah, each in their thin pajamas, shivering each, clutching some part of a shared blanket or a hastily grabbed jacket. Not one of them had remembered shoes. "We heard it." Caleb said, his voice thin against the wind's roar, but surprisingly steady. "The banging. Can we help?" Jesse's first instinct, the ingrained response of a protective parent, was to order them back to the warmth and relative safety of the cabin. But he saw the fear in their eyes, yes, but also a resolute determination, a need to contribute, to be part of the solution, not just helpless bystanders. He remembered Virgil's desperate words. Keep them safe. Safety, he was beginning to understand, wasn't just about shelter from the elements. It was about empowerment, about facing down the metaphorical and sometimes literal storms together. So instead of sending them away, he nodded. "All right, but stay close to me, and be careful." Together, in the howling wind and driving rain, they righted what they could. They gathered scattered tools, their small hands surprisingly strong and capable. Caleb, with an ingenuity that surprised Jesse, helped him rig a temporary brace for the flailing door. Eli, despite the chaos, methodically collected smaller items, tucking them into relatively dry corners. Noah, holding the flashlight steady for Jesse, despite his chattering teeth, was a small, unwavering beacon in the maelstrom. After 2 exhausting, sodden hours, Jesse managed to secure a large, heavy tarpaulin over the worst of the gaping hole in the roof, and rigged a temporary closure for the broken door using heavy rope and 2 cinder blocks. It was a patch job at best, but it would have to do for now. By the time they finally stumbled back into the cabin, soaked to the bone, shivering and streaked with mud, it was nearly dawn. The gray, watery light was just beginning to seep through the windows. Jesse quickly stoked the kitchen stove, its warmth a blessed relief. He found dry towels, brewed a pot of strong, sweet instant cocoa, and handed out his own thick, dry wool socks, which swam on their small feet. He wrapped them in blankets like miniature burritos and settled them near the comforting heat of the stove. Noah, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, but his small body still trembling from the cold and fear, looked up at him. We're gonna stay right, Jesse, even if the barn falls down." The question was small, but it held a universe of anxiety. Jesse paused in the act of adding more wood to the stove, then knelt before them, meeting each of their gazes in turn. "Yeah," he said, his voice firm and unequivocal, a promise etched in the exhaustion lines around his eyes. "Yeah, Noah, you're gonna stay. We're all gonna stay. We'll fix the barn. We fix things here." The next morning was still gray and damp, but the wind had subsided to a mournful sigh. The damage to the barn was extensive. Jesse set the boys to lighter indoor chores, sweeping up mud, helping sort damp tools, stacking small logs by the stove, while he took stock and made a list of urgent repairs. He needed new hinges, several sheets of sturdy plywood, a new shovel replacement, roofing timbers, and most pressingly, an extra skilled pair of hands. He hated asking for help, a trait ingrained from years of self-reliance. But the barn in its current precarious state wouldn't hold against another strong wind, and the forecast was not promising. So after a meager breakfast of leftover stew, he drove to town. The hardware store was half empty when he arrived, save for the usual contingent of elderly retirees browsing screws and washers with the thoughtful deliberation of men selecting fine cigars. Jesse nodded to them politely and began gathering what he needed, his mind racing with calculations and a growing sense of financial dread. At the worn wooden counter, as old Mr. Peterson slowly tallied his purchases, a familiar gravelly voice drawled from behind him. "Heard you had some trouble last night. You fixin' what that wind tried to take." Jesse looked up, startled, Virgil Kane stood there, leaning heavily on the counter, as if it might be the only thing holding him upright. He looked older, thinner, more spectral than Jessie remembered from the auction, but his eyes, though bloodshot, held a flicker of their old sharpness. Gone was the hunted look, replaced by a weary resignation. But something else too, a glint Jessie couldn't quite place. "I heard about the storm." Virgil added, his voice still raspy, but steadier than Jessie had heard it. He was clean-shaven, his clothes worn, but mended. "Saw your boys the other day down by the creek, with that Evelyn lady from the library. They looked taller, looked okay." Jessie measured his words, a new caution informing his reply. "They're doing okay, Virgil. They're good kids." Then a thought struck him. That stranger Finch, the one asking about you about Sarah. He's still around. What does he really want? Virgil's eyes darted away, a flicker of the old fear crossing his face, but it was quickly controlled. Just an old debt, Jessie. Something Sarah got tangled in. He thinks she hid something valuable. He'll move on. He changed the subject abruptly. "Look, Jessie, that's because of you, them being okay." As he spoke, Virgil idly straightened a display of washers on the counter, with a dexterity that seemed at odds with his trembling hands, his gaze briefly sweeping the street outside the store window, with an alertness Jessie hadn't noticed before. It was a fleeting moment, quickly gone. "No," Jessie said quietly, his gaze steady. "That's 'cause they're stronger than anyone, including you or me, ever gave them credit for." Virgil looked down his hands, fidgeting with a loose penny on the counter. He cleared his throat, a rattling sound. I've been working. Clean," he said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. 34 days now. Ain't much, I know. But I'm counting each one. Got a job mucking out stalls over at Henderson's place. He remembered I used to be good with my hands. Jessie didn't say anything, just watched him waiting. Virgil continued, the words tumbling out now, as if a dam had broken. "Look, I can still swing a hammer. Pretty good too when my hands ain't shaking too bad. Still got most of my old tools, the ones I didn't sell. If you need help with that barn of yours, I owe you. I owe those boys more than I can ever repay, but maybe..." The sentence hung there fragile as the morning mist clinging to the window panes. Jessie looked him hard in the eye. He saw the desperation, the shame, but also that spark, that tiny flickering ember of hope, of a desire to make amends, and the faint, almost imperceptible tightening of Virgil's jaw as a car he didn't recognize rumbled past the store. For a long, tense moment, Jessie said nothing. Then, slowly, deliberately, he gave a single, decisive nod. "I could use an extra pair of hands, Virgil. A strong back, too. I'll pick you up at 7 tomorrow morning. We've got a lot to do." Virgil straightened up, just a fraction, a flicker of surprise, then relief in his haunted eyes. "I'll be ready, Jessie. I'll be there." That evening, true to his word, Virgil arrived at Jessie's gate at precisely 7, wearing a faded but clean work shirt that was a size too big for his shrunken frame, and carrying a battered metal toolbox that had clearly seen better decades. The boys who Jessie had told about Virgil's offer to help stood clustered on the porch, watching him, with a strange, unreadable mixture of caution, curiosity, and perhaps a nascent, hesitant hope. Virgil offered a tentative, uncertain wave. None of them waved back immediately, but neither did they hide, which Jessie took as a small victory. Eli, however, after a moment, gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Jessie handed Virgil a spare toolbox and gestured wordlessly towards the damaged barn. They worked side by side in a charged, largely silent companionship for hours. Virgil, despite his obvious physical frailty, moved with a practiced, almost forgotten ease, measuring twice, cutting once, his hands surprisingly steady when occupied. He drove each nail with care and precision. Jesse watched him out of the corner of his eye, noting the persistent tremor in his hands. When he wasn't actively holding something, the way he'd pause sometimes to catch his breath, his face pale. But he didn't complain. He didn't falter. He just worked. At one point late in the afternoon, Eli came out to the barn, carrying a tin cup of water for Virgil and one for Jesse. He stood a careful 5 feet away from Virgil, silent, watchful. I heard you write poems, Eli. Virgil said, his eyes still focused on the nail he was meticulously driving. He didn't look at the boy. Jesse told me about the one you wrote for him. Sounded real fine. Eli blinked, surprised. How did you see it? I didn't. Jesse told me, said it was good, true. Oh. Eli shifted his weight, then took a step closer, placing the cup of water on the workbench nearer to Virgil than he strictly had to. Virgil paused in his hammering, wiped his sweating brow with the back of his hand. I didn't do right by y'all, Eli. By any of you. Or your mama. His voice was low, filled with a profound, weary regret. But I see you now, all of you. And I'm proud of who you're becoming. He didn't wait for a response. He didn't expect one. But Eli's gaze softened just a fraction. Thank you for the water, son. Jesse said quietly to Eli, breaking the charged silence. Eli nodded, gave Virgil one last lingering look, then retreated to the house. By sundown, after a long, arduous day, the barn stood mostly whole again. Reinforced, patched ready, Jesse hoped for the next storm. The new timbers gleamed in the golden light of the setting sun. Jesse and Virgil stood outside, contemplating their handiwork, exhaustion etched on both their faces, the shared scent of sweat, sawdust, and accomplishment hanging in the cool evening air. Thanks, Virgil, Jesse said, meaning it. Couldn't have done it this fast, this well without you. Virgil nodded, looking not at Jesse but at the repaired barn, a flicker of something like pride in his weary eyes. Don't thank me, Jesse. Thank whoever or whatever gave me this one more chance to do something right. Jesse turned to him, the setting sun casting long shadows across the yard. Maybe it was the same person who gave me mine, Virgil. Maybe. The man with the cold gray eyes, Arthur Finch, didn't disappear. His inquiries about Virgil Kane and something Sarah Kane took became more persistent, less subtle. He was seen near the schoolyard at dismissal, his gaze lingering on the triplets as they played. He even approached Jesse directly one afternoon as Jesse was loading supplies into his truck. Mr. Maddox. Finch said, his voice smooth as polished stone. My associates are losing patience. Virgil Kane made promises. Sarah Kane held something that wasn't hers, not a mere heirloom, Mr. Maddox, but records. Information that could be very damaging to certain enterprises. These records are now regrettably tied to the welfare of her children. The boys are in my care now, Jesse stated, his voice level, though his heart pounded. They've got nothing to do with Virgil's past troubles or Sarah's. Finch smiled, a cold reptilian twist of his lips. Perhaps. But Virgil was known to be sentimental. He or Sarah might have tucked that evidence away for the boys. It would be a shame if their newfound peace was permanently disturbed. The veiled threat hung in the air. Jesse, shaken but resolute, warned Finch to stay away from his home and his family. But the encounter left him deeply unsettled. That night, he confronted Virgil, who had been staying in a small rented room above the general store, his sobriety still fragile but holding. Virgil, who is Arthur Finch, really? And what records is he looking for? He's not talking about a music box anymore. Jesse's voice was stern. Virgil visibly paled, sinking onto the edge of his narrow cot. He buried his face in his shaking hands. Oh God, Jesse. I hoped he wouldn't find us. I hoped. Hoped what, Virgil? What did Sarah get herself into? Finally, the truth tumbled out, a torrent of guilt and fear. Sarah, desperate for money, not just for treatment, but to escape a dangerous situation, had gotten entangled with a ruthless criminal organization Finch represented. She'd inadvertently come across incriminating ledgers and digital files detailing their operations. Human trafficking, extortion. She'd tried to gather evidence to expose them, planning to go to the authorities. The loan was a pretext they used to silence her. The music box was a decoy, Jesse, a place she put innocuous things. Virgil choked out. She hid the real evidence somewhere. She told me she had a fail-safe. She thought it would protect the boys. I didn't know where, not exactly. I was too drunk, too scared. I sold the music box for nothing after I just wanted it all to go away. But Finch and his bosses don't believe it's gone, Jesse said grimly. Noah's lumpy rabbit. Jesse's mind flashed to it. The odd way Noah always clutched it, its unusual weight. Could it be a few days later, while the boys were at school, Jesse, with a growing sense of dread, found Noah's rabbit on his cot? His hands trembled as he felt its familiar, oddly dense shape. He found a loose seam and carefully picked at the threads. Inside, nestled amongst the stuffing, was not a music box, but a small, tarnished silver locket, heart-shaped, and a tiny, folded piece of oilskin wrapped around a very small, modern-looking USB drive. He opened the locket. One side held a miniature photo of a smiling Sarah. The other, surprisingly, held a tiny, faded photo of Luke, Jesse's son. Jesse stared, his breath catching. The oilskin, when unfolded, contained a single old ornate key and a scribbled note in Sarah's hand. For emergencies. Bank Deposit Box 3 Rivers Trust. For my boy's future. Luke's mom helped me set it up. She understood about needing to protect what's precious. The drive is the real key. Tell Virgil. The owl sees in the dark. Luke's mom, Mary. His Mary had known Sarah Kane. Had helped her hide something so dangerous, the revelation stunned him. Mary had never mentioned it, but it was like her quiet acts of kindness, her fierce protectiveness. The key, the drive. This must be what Finch's organization was really after. The owl sees in the dark. What did that mean? The box. It was always about a box. Not Luke's box of memories, but the cedarwood chest at the back of his closet under an old winter coat and a moth-eaten blanket that still smelled faintly of Mary's lavender sachets. Jesse hadn't touched it in years, not since Mary passed, and their son Luke not long after. The raw grief had been too much. But that morning, before the encounter with Finch, while searching for a missing boot of Noah's, he'd stumbled across it again. Cedarwood smoothed by time, the hinges creaky but still strong. On the lid, a single word was carved by hand in his wife's careful, elegant script, "Someday." Now understanding dawning, he carried it out to the living room as if it were made of spun glass. The boys were due home from school soon, their laughter usually preceding them up the lane. He sat down heavily in his armchair, slowly laid the box on the scarred coffee table, and lifted the lid. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all in Mary's familiar looping handwriting. At the top of the stack, as if waiting, was one marked with a tarnished silver paperclip. "For when you're ready, my love." He unfolded it with trembling fingers, his vision blurring. "My dearest Jesse, I don't know if I'll ever get to read these with you. If you're reading this without me beside you, I hope it's because you're still here, still trying, still loving. There's something else. A young woman I met, Sarah Kane. She has 3 little boys. Bright, beautiful boys. She's in terrible trouble, Jesse. Not just illness. She stumbled onto something dark, something dangerous. I've been trying to help her quietly find a way to protect her evidence, to protect her sons. She's strong, but she's terrified. If the worst happens, I pray it doesn't. But if it does, promise me you'll at least check on them. I set up a small trust for her boys with a key, if they ever need it. The bank in 3 Rivers. But there's more. Something she entrusted to me, a message for Virgil if things went wrong. The owl sees in the dark. She said he'd understand. It's about where she kept copies of her findings, a place only she and maybe he would know. Remember the good days, my love. And then, Jesse, please find a way to live again. Find new joy. All my love, always Mary. He stopped, reading his breath, catching in a sob. Mary, Sarah, the boys, the key, the drive, the cryptic message. It wasn't a coincidence. It was Mary's enduring love, her courage reaching across time. He didn't cry, not then. But something immense, something vast and profoundly healing, mixed with a cold dread for the danger Sarah had faced, moved inside him. That evening, he brought Mary's cedar box to the porch where the boys were roasting marshmallows. I found something today, he said, his voice thick. These are letters. My wife, Mary. Luke's mom. She knew your mama, Sarah. She cared about her and about you. Sarah was very brave. She was trying to protect you from very bad people. He didn't share the full extent of the danger, not yet, but he handed them a letter from Mary that spoke of hope and new beginnings. They sat in the flickering firelight. Caleb said, "This one says Mary wanted to build a treehouse for Luke." Jesse nodded. "We always talked about it. I didn't really know how." "I could learn," Caleb said. "We could build it. For Luke. And for us." Eli tapped his paper. She wrote, she believed in second chances. His gaze flickered towards town. Jesse looked at him. She did believe that, Eli. Noah, leaning his head against Jesse's shoulder, held his letter, the silver locket key, and the tiny USB drive, now safely in Jesse's pocket. Jesse put his arm around the boy. The threat of Arthur Finch and the organization he represented did not recede. He became bolder. One afternoon, Evelyn, walking home, found him waiting. His insinuations about accidents and vulnerable children being easy to lose left her shaken. She went to Jesse. "He's not going to stop, Jesse," she said. "He knows we have something. Sheriff Hatcher needs to be fully involved." Jesse agreed. But Hatcher, though sympathetic and now more alert to the sedan's sightings and Finch's known associates, was still gathering concrete evidence. "My hands are tied until he makes a direct move, Jesse. But I've got eyes on him. And I'm looking into this organization you mentioned." Sarah's message. The owl sees in the dark. Ring any bells for Virgil's old haunts. Jesse shook his head. Virgil hadn't mentioned it. The dry season had been unusually long and severe. The woods around Three Pines, especially near Widow's Drop, were tinder dry. A strict burn ban was in effect. The climax arrived not with a whisper, but with a roar of flame. Finch, under pressure from his superiors, and increasingly desperate, confronted Virgil late one evening at Henderson's barn. The confrontation escalated. Finch, enraged by Virgil's continued insistence that he knew nothing more, struck him. In the struggle, a kerosene lantern Virgil used was knocked over its flaming contents, spilling onto dry hay. Flames erupted with terrifying speed. Virgil, stunned and injured, tried to beat out the flames. Panic seized him. He had to warn Jesse. Finch, seeing the blaze spread, perhaps realizing he'd gone too far, fled. Virgil, coughing, stumbled towards Jesse's cabin, shouting, "Fire, Jesse! Finch! He started it!" Jesse, alerted, was already moving. "Boys, fire, get dressed. Evelyn, call the fire department." Evelyn, who had stayed for dinner, was on the phone, her voice miraculously calm. The fire, fanned by a fickle wind, raced towards Jesse's property, devouring dry underbrush. Escape by road was cut off. Their only chance was the creek path behind Jesse's land, which led past the treacherous edge of Widow's Drop. "We have to go through the woods to the creek," Jesse commanded, grabbing an axe and a wet blanket. "Caleb, Eli, stick together. Noah, hold my hand tight." Virgil appeared. "Jesse, Finch, he's mad." "No time, Virgil, can you make it?" Virgil nodded grimly. "I'll help." The retreat through the smoke-filled woods was a nightmare. Embers rained down. The heat was intense. Jesse led, clearing burning debris. Evelyn herded the older boys. Virgil, despite his burns, brought up the rear, swatting flames. Noah, clinging to Jesse's hand, lumpy rabbit clutched tight, stumbled but never cried out. They reached the creek path near Widow's Drop, just as the fires seemed to surround them. A massive flaming branch crashed down, blocking their main path to the wider, safer part of the creek, trapping them. Ahead, the ground near the ravine was unstable. "We're cut off," Caleb cried. "Jesse, the ground, it's giving way." Jesse saw the crumbling edge. Noah, startled by a falling ember, lost his footing and slid down a short, steep incline towards a narrow fissure in the earth, an old, forgotten test shaft from defunct mining operations, part of the dangers of Widow's Drop. He wasn't in the main ravine, but trapped in the tight opening, dislodged rocks tumbling around him. "Noah!" Jesse screamed, raw terror ripping through him. He scrambled towards the fissure, but flames licked dangerously close, the ground groaning. "Dad, don't!" Caleb yelled. "It's too unstable." It was Virgil who acted. He grabbed a coil of old rope they'd used for the barn. "Jesse, the log. There's a small crossing further down. If we can distract them, get the boys across. I know this place. The owl sees in the dark. It's an old smuggling spot near here. The real evidence, Sarah gathered, is stashed there." Before Jesse could process, Virgil was moving towards the fire's edge, yelling, drawing attention. And then Arthur Finch, his face contorted with rage, emerged from the smoke on the far side of the narrower creek crossing. A burning, precarious log. He doubled back. "You're not getting away, Kane," Finch shrieked, brandishing a heavy tree limb. "You owe us in those records." Virgil, on the burning log, turned to face Finch, a desperate, momentary diversion. "Get Noah, Jesse, the owl's nest. It's a hidden cave near the old hollow oak by the rapids. Go," he screamed. "Finch, you get nothing." Finch lunged. The log groaned, cracked. Both men plunged into the churning water below, just as it collapsed. Virgil was sucked under by a fierce current, disappearing from sight. Finch thrashed and then was also swept downstream. Jesse, heart pounding, looked at Noah, trapped in the fissure. The flames were closing in. "Evelyn, get Caleb and Eli to that crossing now. I'm getting Noah." "Jesse, no, it's suicide," Evelyn cried. But she obeyed, fear and resolve etched on her face as she pulled the older boys toward the burning log Virgil had pointed out. Jesse ignored the heat, the collapsing earth. He reached Noah, who was wedged tightly, coughing. "Hold on, son, I've got you." With superhuman effort, he worked to free Noah, embers burning his clothes, smoke choking his lungs. He managed to pull Noah free just as the ground beneath him gave way further. He shielded Noah with his body as they slid, landing hard but away from the worst of the immediate flames, though still perilously close. He was burned, bruised, but Noah was for the moment safe. He dragged Noah towards where Evelyn was frantically motioning them across the still smoldering remnants of the log, crossing the fire roaring behind them. They huddled on a small island in the creek, coughing terrified as the fire raged on both banks. Hours seemed to pass. Finally, through thinning smoke came sirens and shouting. Sheriff Hatcher and the volunteer fire department. Arthur Finch was pulled from the creek downstream alive, battered, and promptly arrested. He was ranting, "This isn't over, my employers. They don't forget." His words sent a fresh chill through Jesse. Of Virgil Kane, however, there was no sign. They searched until dawn. The creek, swollen and debris-choked, yielded nothing. The following days were a blur. Jesse's cabin miraculously was saved, though the barn was a smoldering ruin. The town rallied. Food, clothing, offers to rebuild poured in. The fire had scarred the land, but forged stronger community bonds. Virgil Kane was presumed drowned, a hero. Jesse held a small memorial. Eli read a poem. Noah placed Virgil's wooden feather by the water, but Finch's parting words echoed. Jesse showed Hatcher the USB drive. It was encrypted, military grade. Sarah was into something far deeper than we knew, Jesse, Hatcher said grimly. And Finch's employers, they'll want this. Badly. A week later, the renewed threat materialized. Two men, quiet, well-dressed, exuding an aura of cold professionalism that made Finch look like an amateur, appeared at Jesse's gate. "Mr. Maddox," one said, his voice devoid of emotion. "We represent certain interested parties. Arthur Finch was an expendable asset. We understand you have something that belongs to us. Information Sarah Kane compiled. We would very much like it back. For the children's sake, of course." Before Jesse could react, Caleb, his face a mask of teenage defiance, stepped forward. "You stay away from my brothers and my dad." "Brave boy," the second man sneered. "But bravery has its limits." Suddenly, a voice cut through the tension, low and gravelly. "It does. And so does your reach." From the shadows of the woodshed, a figure emerged. Leaner, scarred, but unmistakably Virgil Kane. He held a hunting rifle steady as a rock. Behind him, Sheriff Hatcher and two deputies stepped out, weapons drawn. "What the?" the lead organization man gasped. "Surprise." Virgil said, a grim smile playing on his lips. "Turns out the owl sees pretty damn well in the dark. And so do I." He hadn't drowned. Knowing the organization Finch worked for would never stop, he'd use the fire and the fight with Finch as an elaborate charade to fake his death, buying time. He'd made his way to the Owl's Nest, an old hidden moonshiner's cave Sarah had discovered. Retrieved the master copies of her evidence. The USB drive was just a partial encrypted set and a small cache of emergency supplies. Then he'd contacted Sheriff Hatcher, laying out the whole sordid tale of the organization, using Sarah's detailed notes as proof. Hatcher, initially skeptical, had been convinced by the sheer detail and corroborating intel from his own sources. They'd set a trap, waiting for the organization's higher-ups to make their move. Sarah Kane left a very clear trail for anyone who cared to look, gentlemen. Hatcher said, his voice like iron. And she left brave friends to see it through. The standoff was brief. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered, the organization men surrendered. The evidence Virgil provided, combined with what was on the USB, now decrypted by federal experts Hatcher had brought in, was enough to dismantle a significant criminal enterprise. Virgil's return was a shock. Relief, anger, confusion warred on the boys' faces. "You let us think you were dead." Caleb accused, his voice tight with betrayal, and hurt even as relief flooded his eyes. Virgil flinched. "Son, I had to. It was the only way to be sure they'd come out of the shadows, the ones pulling Finch's strings, the only way to truly keep you safe like Sarah wanted, like I should have done from the start." His gaze met Jesse's. "I owed her that." I owed you all that. Jesse nodded slowly, the weight of Virgil's sacrifice, his cunning settling in. You did, Virgil. You more than did. Justice for Sarah Kane and for Virgil was finally served not just on Finch, but on the organization that had hounded her. Virgil, scarred but sober, slowly began to mend. His reconciliation with the boys was hesitant, fragile, but deepened by a new profound respect. He found work on a neighboring ranch, and Sunday dinners at Jesse's became a quiet tradition. The key from Noah's rabbit opened the deposit box. Inside letters from Sarah, photos, and the savings bonds Mary had helped her set up. A legacy of love. The library became a hub. Evelyn, now an indispensable part of their lives, organized fundraisers. She and Jesse, their bond forged in crisis, found a quiet, steady love. One afternoon, months later, Evelyn found Jesse on his rebuilt porch. You look different, she said. I feel different, he admitted. The boys there, my son's Evelyn, Virgil, he's family too in his own way. He paused. And you're part of this. She took his hand. You saved them, Jesse. Virgil helped protect them, and you all saved each other, and maybe a bit of me too. That night, Jesse dreamed not of fire, but of a sprawling treehouse, its foundation solid, its walls woven from memories, courage, and love. Autumn arrived full of crisp air and color. The Maddox household, now including Virgil for Sunday dinners, settled into a healing rhythm. Eli suggested a memory quilt. Evelyn arrived with fabric. Quilts are story maps, she said, stitched with love. Each contributed Eli's singed flannel scrap of Jesse's Caleb, a square from Noah's old rocket shirt. Noah, a piece of his arrival pillowcase, Eli, a poem on muslin. Jesse added Luke's faded bandana. Virgil, after a long silence, offered a small, perfectly square piece of blue denim from Sarah's favorite work shirt, which he'd kept hidden away. His stitches were surprisingly neat. The quilt hung above the fireplace became a testament. This cabin, Jesse said, for the first time feels full, overflowing. That's what belonging does, Evelyn whispered. It fills the empty rooms. Evelyn penned another column, stitched in deception, mended by truth, the unraveling of a shadow and the forging of a family in 3 pines. Jesse clipped it, placing it with Mary's letters. The town began its own quilting projects, inspired. Years passed. The cabin evolved. Jesse and Evelyn married. The boys thrived, Caleb, an aerospace engineer. Eli, a published poet. Noah expanding his second chance places. One summer afternoon they gathered. Jesse announced his retirement from the honey stand, but not from life. He planned woodworking classes, maybe even writing. Got a few stories of my own to tell. He grinned. Noah played piano from the cabin notes, mingling with crickets. You ever wonder, Ev? Jesse asked, if I hadn't stepped up that day. Every good story, Jesse, she said, begins with a courageous step someone almost didn't take. He nodded. Sometimes I think, maybe love finds a way to keep moving forward. The world hands us broken pieces, she said. Sometimes we find the courage to make something new from the wreckage. Eli presented Jesse with a hand-bound photo album, the Maddox family stitched in, hope deceived by danger grown in love. Inside, photos, notes, and a new poem. This is the place where darkness once crept, but courage in secret its promises kept. Where hands that held loss and a hidden hard fight now reach out together and hold to the light. Where stories of sorrow and embers and rain are stitched into shelter again and again. Jesse closed it throat tight. Caleb said, we wouldn't be who we are without you, Dad. And Virgil. Noah, hand on Jesse's shoulder, agreed. You both showed us how to be strong and kind. Eli smiled. We're all still growing. Together. Later, Jesse and Evelyn on the porch. Remember what you said at the auction? Evelyn asked. I don't have much, but what I had, I was willing to share. Still true, he agreed. She turned to him. You were wrong about one thing, Jesse Maddox. What's that, my love? You've always had everything that truly matters. And you and Virgil and these boys taught this whole town what it means to fight for it, even when the wolves are real. He looked at her eyes full. He felt it all finally, irrevocably come wonderfully, blessedly whole. Not because everything was perfect, but because they had chosen courageously to keep showing up. For love, for each other, for hope even in the face of the deepest darkness. And that's the story of how one man's quiet choice, amplified by another's hidden courage, became the everyday miracle that changed not just 3 young lives, but his own, and in doing so, helped mend the heart of a small town called 3 Pines, proving that even the most tangled threads can be rewoven into a tapestry of enduring strength. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching or reading from? And if you'd like more true-to-life stories filled with kindness, healing, and the enduring power of second chances against all odds, feel free to subscribe. Until next time, take care, stay warm, and never underestimate the profound power of quiet love and persistent, even deceptive courage.